Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. I am Brian Knudsen, hanging out in an undisclosed location, as you can tell from the background.
If you're watching.
If you're watching.
Otherwise, you could describe it. It's a little bit different than his usual.
Behind me is different. But yeah, and if the sound sounds any different, that would explain it as well. But you heard Milou, or you saw Milou. How are you, Milou?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to our conversation today because I think this is actually an area that I have to admit I'm not sure I've even really thought about that much. And I think that maybe speaks wider to the larger community that database security, that's what we're talking about today, is really an area that I think even cybersecurity experts might not think about it because they're thinking about general access to production environments, and part of that is just the database. And we're thinking through potential general access controls and maybe aren't thinking about column level encryption, as well as thinking through actually like role-based access control and concerns within the actual database.
Yeah, definitely don't hear a lot about database security. And you know, we do hear about application security a little bit more. We hear about OS level security, obviously network perimeter type security. But yeah, so we're going to have on today is going to be David Klee. He's an old friend of mine, full disclosure. We've known each other for many years, and never really been in the trenches per se, but through local communities, have gotten to know each other well. So really looking forward to chatting with him about databases. His expertise really is in the database side of things, particularly with SQL Server. A lot of people may have heard of him. He's got some really interesting niche communities that he lives in. Particularly, he kind of made a name for himself on tuning databases running in virtual machines, which for those of you that were in the early days of virtualization, wasn't an area that worked very well at first. It took a while before that really became a thing that a lot of organizations were willing to do. He's since, of course, moved to the cloud with everybody else, and so he's seen in a lot of ways. He kind of works for himself and does his own has his own company, not by himself by any means. He's got people that work for him now. So yeah, he's seen it a lot of different ways, a lot of different places. So I think he's going to have a lot of really good insights on how to make databases secure. So with that, should we bring him on, Milou?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. And we're back with David Klee. David, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself so everybody knows your voice compared to Milou and myself?
Absolutely. My name is David Klee. I am the founder of a niche consulting company you've probably never heard of called Heraflux Technologies. I am a total nerd with SQL Server and all the infrastructure down below it. I have a lot of fun doing performance and availability architectures with some really big toys out there.
Yeah, David and I, like I mentioned before, have known each other for quite a while, so when we sat down to look at who we wanted to invite on, David was high on the list. So let's talk a bit about databases. Specifically, let's talk about the security side of databases, which is not a topic that gets discussed very often. It's not a topic I hear from my side too often. So, David, from your perspective, let's kind of start off with what companies don't do well when it comes to database security. I know it's a long list, so we'll
Might be a loaded question.
Yeah. Let's maybe give kind of the tops of the waves, and maybe we'll dig in from there.
The companies that don't do well would essentially be a great big asterisk. There are a handful that do things well. I think that's a shorter list. Big finance, banks, only because they're under regulatory scrutiny and checks for this kind of stuff. But when you start really boiling it down, the mom and pop shops, you name your industry, chances are it's not as secure as you think it is. And I see this stuff every single day, and quite honestly, it's frightening, because when you say what company or what industries do it well, I'm struggling to come up with the list.
And what are some of the gaps that you kind of see, like some of the things that you feel like a lot of companies consistently aren't doing when they're talking about securing their databases?
There's a lot. Part of it is role-based access control, because the data itself may be locked down, but there might be gates put into the application that say person X in group Y can't see data of type Z. And a lot of these things are missing, or people have been misclassified. There's a general purpose, you have ownership of everything kind of group, and I see this more times than not. And then you start boiling it down. These people with that level of permission in the app may have inherited permission if they actually know how to get into the database and they've got everything. And that's yet another thing that keeps me up at night.
I don't think that's like super surprising. I think it ties into some of the other conversations that we've had, where sometimes it's really like the security fundamentals, which for some of us in the space feel kind of like, we're like, wow, we've been talking about asset management or access control forever, and it's still like organizations still have weak password policies and stuff like that. But I'm not totally surprised to hear you say that you're like, well, in general, because I feel like database management, it might be like separated to a particular team, right, on the engineering side, and they're kind of going from this model that everyone within the engineering organization that needs access might be an owner of the system, right? But that's really not the case. There should be very, very few with the highest level of security, and I think that is not super shocking, but it is definitely alarming to hear that role-based access controls are really, really just not there when we're talking about databases.
It's tough. And the 3 words, third-party apps. The database is just the container of the data. You still have to have an app to let the users get to it. So the data itself might be encrypted at rest. There might be gatekeepers and guards in place, but if the app itself doesn't enforce a lot of it, and your business depends on the third-party app, and you can't control how secure it is, what do you do?
Yeah, and as somebody who was an app developer, as well as a part-time DBA, I did most of that control in the application side of things. All the data came in through the app and then went to the database. All the data got pulled by the app from the database and then given to the user. So it kind of makes sense that that's where they would do that.
Yeah.
The problem becomes is if you have multiple apps trying to get in there, and of course if somebody were to get past the app, or the app isn't doing its job. So defense in depth, I guess, is a big topic that we should talk about here in things like scrubbing data, making sure you've got clean data so that, Bobby drop table doesn't come in and cause some major issue. If the app's not doing it, the database then becomes the layer that it needs to do, correct?
Exactly. And in a lot of cases, though, and I'm not trying to play devil's advocate, but I kind of am, when the foundation is set to allow all and the app becomes the gatekeeper, and now you start integrating in from the side, you're still at the mercy of the primary driver for the business, which is app X. And now you have to worry about not breaking the main application that's delivering the business value to the business. You've got to worry about all the security, all the pieces around it. And making these changes is incredibly difficult. And a lot of companies just don't.
Yeah, and that takes a special relationship, if you will, between the database team and the app team, to make sure that one, and again, this goes back to my experience having worked with full-time DBAs and been my own DBA on occasion, is knowing what data should be in that field and what data isn't in that field. And that's not a technical problem. That's a communication, that's a process. It's how do we work together as a team to create the most secure environment type of a problem. Our customers, I know my own experience at the couple companies in which I was a developer. You've seen it with large enterprises and across multiple different places. Like, how common is that? Are they generally working well together to define those things?
Defining? No.
It's
tough because, say I have to make your job more difficult because we are under PCI compliance regulations. They don't care that your business is subject to all this stuff. They don't care about the fines for this. They just want to be able to do their job quicker. An example of this, I was doing a health check for somebody this morning. There's one particular manufacturing API platform that we do a lot with. The people at a front counter in a retail store love to type in customer credit card information into a customer notes field so that if they're repeat buyers, they don't have to ask them for their credit card every time. The process is always, you can't do this, but I have a database query over here with a regular expression, so I don't see the number, but I get the count of how many credit card numbers exist in that field. Every health check I do, there's at least 10.
Yeah, and classic data sensitivity posture management,
yeah.
DSPM,
yeah.
Is kind of a newer field that is all about knowing where your sensitive data is at and who has access to it, stuff like that. Like, that's a huge deal, and if you can't block it, you got to be able to figure out where it is.
Yeah. So part of my health check is a database query that says I run it every 30 minutes. If there's a credit card number that somebody puts in there, I wipe it out. Simple as that. And they hate me for it. But you have to stay clean. You can't let this stuff slide.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to hear that the organizations that you're working with, right, that you actually can build the query to just automatically do that, right? Because otherwise, the company's only as good as their policy in that sense. They can have pop-ups and banners for those individual users to being like, do not put sensitive information in this field, like only use this as a notes category. But from what you're saying, it doesn't matter what you might put as like a red flag. They're still going to do it anyways because it's convenient.
Exactly. If they can do something to make their job quicker or less work, they're going to do it. And if that means putting you at risk for a security violation, they generally don't care unless there's enforcement in there. So these systems that we're automating this for, it's okay. We're only altering that number, and we're not actually storing the data anywhere. We just need to pick it up before it lands in a database backup.
Right.
So let's talk about the other big trend going on in the industry right now, which is cloud. And obviously that changes the security posture. It changes the way that we approach all these things. I'm assuming it changes the nature of databases and specifically database security as well, doesn't it?
How many hours do we have?
Not that many.
So bottom line, it shifts it dramatically, but it doesn't change it at all in the same way. So try this. You go to the 80s. The database folks out there owned the entire stack. They were the ones provisioning SAN-LUNs and plugging in hard drives and cabling things up. You hit the 90s, okay, maybe somebody else dealt with that, but the DBAs would hit Windows or Linux and, work their way up. And now, up until cloud, there was such a sharp distinction in duties that it was so siloed nobody would cross those lines. And then you enter cloud. And now, hey, DBA, you need to create network security groups. You need to deal with application data handling. You got to deal with a load balancer. Oh, and by the way, you still got to manage the entire database platform and everything on it. You just don't necessarily have to work with HA or DR. But yeah, you go deal with all that security stuff so that this can communicate with all the apps. But you still got to keep it secure. It's foreign. It's foreign on one of the worst possible levels out there. So these folks that don't have the background in it have been thrown into the deep end without a lifesaver, and they have to deal with this on their own. That's why, in my opinion, you see so many cloud bucket security breaches. That's why there's so much of the stuff that it's wide open and nobody knows because they're not reading the manual. They don't know what they don't know about it, and they're under the gun to deliver. So it's just go and do and then wait for something to break. And the problem is when it breaks big, and it's front page news.
I feel like we're entering the a little bit of fear mongering, which Brian and I definitely do on some of the episodes where we're like, we're not trying to terrify people, but I'm like, ooh, yes. No, when we're thinking about how quickly the industry has changed, right? It's also a bit of an unreasonable expectation for database administrators or to suddenly be like, oh, also you need to be a security expert and we don't have the time to give you training, right? Like unless team members are normally proactively asking for that or doing that, it's really rare that an organization is like, you need to go get XYZ certificate.
Yeah, I'm not trying to scare anybody out there, but this is the reality that folks in my industry are in every single day. Most folks, as a career DBA, You're not a career DBA. Nobody starts out being a DBA. Almost nobody. You're software developer. Just like a lot of systems engineers start out more on the hardware side, help desk, and you kind of work your way up that way. The folks in the data space don't know network security. They don't know application development. They don't know a lot of the pieces around it. Cloud introduces this whole other vector of insecure practices that can be tossed into it because they don't have the background in it. And unless you have essentially a security auditing team following them around, or a company that's actually willing to invest in their people and train like mad, it's an interesting spot. And again, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but you have to trust but verify with any of this stuff. And it's an interesting time.
So as you've worked with customers on that front, and obviously you've seen good and you've seen bad in that side of things, I guess what advice, what scenarios have you seen where the customer has worked security into their database practices successfully? Like, is it certain teams need to make sure they work together? You mentioned security person following them everywhere they go is obviously not a doable thing, but what have they done successfully to be able to introduce those practices?
The successful vector to introduce this is from the top, a mandate that says we will be secure. And it's not we're secure and that we can check all the boxes on a PCI or HIPAA compliant audit. It's we need to be truly secure. And throw away the tech. You get in a security expert and you say, holistically, what do we need to do to be secure? What amount of training do we need for the folks? At each layer, what security do we need in general? So data masking, data obfuscation, role-based access, role-based control in the application as well as the database encryption at rest, proper encryption and backups, proper testing and backups while you're in there. And then top down, everybody's got to buy into it at every level. And the training has to be there, not just from a technical perspective, but for all the users. It has to be there. Those are the organizations that can properly control this stuff because everybody is part of the security footprint. The people are the biggest aspect of it. It's not the actual technology. If the willingness of the business is there to secure it, you can secure it. But they have to have the time, they have to have the training, and arguably they have to have the budget because that encompasses everything else.
Yeah, I think that's an area that a lot of organizations struggle with is I think they underestimate like how much securing their systems will actually cost because a lot of the time they're like, oh, we're going to bring on an InfoSec person and they're going to come in and that InfoSec person is going to be like, well, we have to get all of these additional tools and monitoring in place and like alerting and we need a security operations center and all of these things, which they're also really sexy, so they're expensive at the moment, right? It's the things that we know a lot of organizations need, right? So the demand is definitely there, but I don't think organizations necessarily realize if they are going to take that top-down approach that like they also have to put their money where their mouth is and also invest heavily in security to making sure that they're potentially mitigating any risks that they have, which I've been in a lot of rooms where I've had to explain that, right? And sometimes they get it and other times they're like, we don't care or we don't care right now. And I think unfortunately that's the stance for a lot of organizations that they do care. They just are like, we don't have budget for this right now. And InfoSec compliance, IT, architecture, they're all asking for this stuff forever. And then suddenly something bad happens, right? And then it's like, well, we tried.
Yeah. Or the priorities are in the wrong spot. It's like, we're going to secure it, but we're going to secure that and not this. Got a good example of that. A big healthcare organization that we work with. The databases that can store the patient, the what do you call it? The exam, the actual procedure costs are more tightly controlled than the patient databases. So they're going to secure to make sure nobody knows how much they're actually paying for an event. But the people, yeah, whatever. It's frightening.
So the financial records are more secure than the personal health information, the PHI.
Correct. By far.
That shows a distorted set of priorities, in my opinion. But
correct.
We'll leave that aside for now.
I think that might also be a risk of regulatory involvement of actually like financial regulators might have more sway than healthcare ones do, just because their footprint is larger. So the risk of non-compliance for financial issues might actually be higher.
Yep. And
really
technically,
interesting.
on a HIPAA compliance report, they check all the boxes. But there's an academic checkbox versus a real world checkbox, and the real world checkboxes are not really well covered there.
No, I like that academic versus real world distinction there, because and Milou and I have talked about that quite a bit, is, are you doing security for the sake of compliance, or are you doing security for the sake of security? They're two totally different worlds to live in.
Yes. Yeah, I come from a very operational perspective, and if you say this thing is tight, I shouldn't be able to get into it, period. One hedge fund that we worked at, you have zero access direct to the production environment. And if you even try, somebody shows up at your desk with a sidearm. I'm not exaggerating anything. This is real. There are environments where security is the mandate. There's no illusion of privacy, and it's tight, and you follow the rules. For the organizations that haven't had that top-down mandate, it's still Wild West.
Yeah, it's also interesting to know, like, when the top-down mandate is coming, right? Because, again, for highly regulated industries, such as finance and healthcare, they do also generally have regulators actually, like, breathing down their necks, right? There's significantly more proactive reporting, as opposed to in technology for non-regulated tech. They don't really have that threat. So they're not in it unless something goes wrong, right? And then they're doing the top-down approach of, well, we had a major security breach, or, oh, we're under monitorship, right? Like, then that's a very different approach. And I hope that security is the mandate for a lot of organizations. Unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of them have done that out of something. Because again, it is expensive, right? Like, I think that it is considered a cost center when we're thinking about building innovative technologies. Securing them can slow people down, and it can also cost a lot of money.
It's fascinating. To your point there, security should not be reactive. It can't be, because it's too late.
Well, I mean, that's so much the story of all security in all facets of this industry is, if it's a bolt-on, it's probably not good enough. It's a people problem as much as a technology problem. It's something that's got to be top-down, otherwise it's going to get skirted. It's going to get put aside. Which I guess kind of brings us to the topic of, kind of the holistic picture of things. Databases don't sit alone. We talked about the application side, but let's talk about the other side when it comes to the infrastructure on which a database sits on. Are there any special, OS level, storage array level aspects of the infrastructure that are special for the database side of things? Or is it safe to say that it's, you need to make sure those are as tight as possible no matter what?
Bottom line, you got to make sure they're tight. But realistically, if you've got sensitive data anywhere, be it in a database or other, the infrastructure's got to be able to be secured for it. Encryption at rest on disk, a lot of good storage arrays today have this. Same thing within the cloud. Usually it's either a checkbox or it's on and you can't do anything about it. This is the way it is. And that's a good thing. Backup encryption is always a little different. Backup encryption is essentially an opt-in thing rather than an opt-out thing, and a lot of companies don't do that. Now, if it's local inside a locked data center, maybe it's not the worst thing. I'm not saying it's good, but the second you go pick those up and transport them somewhere, watch out. There's data breaches all over the place. An example of this, some auditors at a healthcare company that we work with had a copy of the data for whatever reason and lost a laptop. Next thing you know, the info's out on the dark web. And not fun. OS level, there are guest level encryption routines that you can run. There's different packages out there. There's BitLocker and a bunch of other third-party stuff. They all work well. The odds that somebody's going to walk away with an operating system and all the stuff in it's kind of slim unless it's in a backup, and that should be encrypted anyway. The database is always portable, and it's got to be secured in the database. I claim that the encryption should come from the application, because trying to do encryption in a database is pretty brutal. It's got a lot of overhead. It'll kill you on licensing costs. It may actually add so much overhead it might not even work. But at the same time, if the application can support governing the the encryption in the database, it may actually be worth it. You've got to handle all of this stuff. There's no line that says I can stop worrying about security here.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think is, there's no place to stop. Security's got to be embedded into every level of it. We talk a lot about, hey, this thing has data at rest encryption, and if it's just locking the disk, the bits that actually get written, and the array itself is unencrypting it before it serves it up to whoever's asking for it, well, you're not really protecting it other than them walking away with the disk. At which point you probably got a bigger issue just because somebody's in your data center taking disks away. So then, you start looking at higher levels, what is the highest level that you should do your encryption at in order to ensure that no one can backdoor it. And like you said, with backups, that's a big part of it as well, is because, we're starting to see a lot of ransomware events or data espionage events where they go straight for the backups because, one, all of the data is in the backups, and two, we want to destroy those because if we're going to try and hold you ransom through an encryption event or through a deletion event, that's the easy way out, is to have backups. So, don't ignore the backups. That's intruding a little bit into my day-to-day world. So it is always top of mind for me. But yeah, those backups can be so critical on both ends of that spectrum.
And the tough part is if data gets put into the wrong spot in a database, and now you have a backup in 10 locations, and let's say a GDPR request comes along to remove some data, how do you get that data out of all your backups, especially if they're immutable? So this is why you've got to protect it on the front end, because on the back end, it gets even worse.
Totally. Okay. Well, I think we got to a pretty good stopping point there. So, Milou, why don't you ask David our final question?
Yes, so David, I'll be curious to hear this, especially with the story that you shared earlier, specifically of like retailers, like employees, like putting in credit card details directly into notes files. I personally have had issues where, like, at doctor's offices, I've been asked, they're like, "Oh yeah, I'll just put your credit card like in your file," and I'm like, "No, thank you." Like, and so I've definitely am somebody who's sometimes made my fight for privacy feel more challenging in my like day-to-day life as a consumer. But I had a CTO basically tell me that he felt like the fight for privacy was dead and now it's the fight for security. And based off of your background and what you do in your day-to-day, I would just love to get your take on that. Do you feel like the fight for privacy is dead and we're really just focused on security, or do you think there's still value in the actual fight for privacy?
I think the fight for privacy has rolled into the fight for security. Because the fight for privacy can't die. If it dies, we're all hosed. But security is a superset of privacy. You have to cover this stuff. And the challenge is you just simply have to have the business buy into the fight. If the business can buy into the fight and they're willing to put the budget behind it to make it happen with the training, the process, the expertise, and arguably the checks and balances at each layer, the security will happen, and therefore the privacy will happen. If the business doesn't buy in from the top down, it's game over.
I like that. I like the thought about thinking of security as a part of our entire fight for privacy. It's part of the reason why we do what we do every day, is because we are motivated by the basic principles of keeping personal information private if we can. And I think you've spent your life's work doing that, so we appreciate that a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, in my industries, it's where I've worked, it's been financial data, it's been mass media data, it's been healthcare data, it's been everything in between. And I see it day in and day out, and I want to make it a better place. I don't want people's info out there. It's got to happen in order for this stuff to continue to work.
Yeah. And knowing a few of your clientele you've had over the years, I think most people listening can directly thank David for some of that privacy they get, because he's worked with some big name brands over the years. So really appreciate your efforts there, David, and for you joining us on Socializing Security. It's been a great conversation. I hope people take databases a little bit more seriously now.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. And if anybody has any questions on this stuff, don't hesitate. Yell as loud as you can in your organization upwards. If something's not secure, voice it, because they need to hear it.
Awesome. And David, if team members that listen and people that listen to Socializing Security want to contact you, what's the best way to do that? Is that maybe on LinkedIn or through the website?
Yeah, if you just contact info@heroflux.com or on LinkedIn, my name is David Klee up there. Do not hesitate, reach out. There's never a sales pitch with this stuff. We're just here to help. We're just total nerds with this stuff that just want to make the world a better place the way we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Great conversation with David, don't you think, Milou?
Yeah, he's so easy to talk to and just so knowledgeable on the topic that it's just like, I think we could have kept going. And as you said, it was like, do you guys have hours? I think we really could have just like kept talking about other, even beyond just database security, really diving into some other topic areas. I think he just knows a lot about it and has seen some crazy things.
Yeah, so you may have noticed that there's a lot of really short answers between the three of us. None of us really probed too terribly deep, and I think that's because we all knew how deep it could go. So we were kind of avoiding going down too many really deep rabbit holes. That's not to say we couldn't. Like, we could have them on another 5 episodes and have 5 specific topics to go really deep in. Obviously, there's a lot to it because databases are out there. Everywhere in the world, every application has a database behind it, generally speaking, and the requirements on the databases are no different than any other application that's out there. When I say application, I'm talking uninstallable application on an operating system. So there's a lot that goes into it. They are super complex. Some of the stories he's told me about how he has tuned databases just kind of blow my mind. Because they are so integral to the performance of an application.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about just like some of the things that he said. I feel like, man, we could have like coined some of the things, but I think his thought leadership specifically around that top down is really important when it comes to security. Is something, I mean, compliance officers, we say this all the time, right? Like top down management, top down. Like this is not a new concept, but it was just really refreshing for someone to be like, no, but seriously, like this only works if the executive team is bought in and is also bringing budget and spend to making sure that we're securing these things and thinking about the fact that, security shouldn't be reactive. I was like, man, in an ideal world. When he said that, I almost like laughed because I was just like, man, I would love if security wasn't reactive. I think that's a future state for most organizations. It's really rare that security is built in by design. There's a couple organizations that I think do that really well, but they're very big. And so I think for most smaller organizations, their security program is reactive. So, and ideally, if you build it out, you can secure it and then hopefully turn into a steady state of proactive security. But I think right now, unfortunately, for a lot of companies, it's still very reactive.
Yeah. An important underlying to something that I think we all have on our notes of how to do security better, which is everything's integrated. It needs to be there. It needs to be one of the very first building blocks we put down as we build something new. And the database should not be forgotten in that. Operating system, all the infrastructure components, database, application, all those pieces need to have security built in for their unique piece of the puzzle, but also as a part of as part of the broader whole.
Yeah, and I think just when we're thinking about security strategy, an area that a lot of companies just like want either resource-wise or just like demand, access controls are not like a fun thing to do. As somebody who has spent way too much time poring over Excel sheets, just looking like, does this person have the right level of access? Does it? And like, unfortunately, like there are automation tools in place to do this, but a lot of companies still do this super manually. And so making sure that you're thinking about your database as part of that and making sure that not all of your engineers are system admins and they're not considered owners of your database, because as much as you trust those individuals, maybe we should have fewer of those that are in that I hold all the keys to the castle, mainly because, again, like their accounts could get compromised and then you're just in a really bad place. So thinking about making sure that you're thinking through database access controls is a takeaway for sure. And then also thinking about, are you really scrutinizing the third-party apps that you're bringing into your databases?
Having done a lot of those in the past, random application comes in, they need a place to land a small database. Well, here's a instance we already have up and running. Let's just dump it there without the proper digging into what it really needs to actually work. The wider open the doors are, the more trust you give it, the more likely it's going to work, isn't a proper solution anymore. You've got to aim for that zero trust and not automatically just trust everything. So Cool. Well, that was another great conversation. I'm glad we got David on. We hope to see you all next week, but we appreciate you socializing with us and learning along with us in this episode with David Klee. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Take care, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.